You've tuned into another edition of The Break Room, a weekly conversation about how the City of St. Augustine works from those who do the work every day. Hosted by the City of St. Augustine's Communications Director, Melissa Wissel, The Break Room offers a closer look at the different city departments and provides updates on current and upcoming projects and events. And now for your host of The Break Room, Melissa Wissel.
Welcome to The Break Room. We're glad you could join us. The Break Room is a place where we can sit back together for a few minutes and take a break from our daily work, catch up with coworkers, and hear about what's happening in and around the city. I'm Melissa Wissel, Communications Director for the City of St. Augustine. As the nation's oldest city, it is our responsibility to preserve our history and our historic resources so that we may continue to tell our story for generations to come. But with the threat of rising seas, impacts of seasonal weather events, and especially hurricanes, we find ourselves in an incredibly vulnerable position of losing our most important assets and our infrastructure. With that being said, the city has completed a grant project entitled Resilient Heritage in the Nation's Oldest City. Well, I'm happy to welcome back to the studio Jenny Wolfe, the city's Historic Preservation Officer, to tell us. Jenny, welcome back. It's great to have you.
Thank you for having me, and thanks for this opportunity. If I could just jump in, I'd like to first just really say what we mean when we're talking about heritage assets and cultural resources.
Absolutely.
Because they are interchangeable. And a lot of what we think about in the city is, just historic preservation and archaeology, but we like to think of them as one: cultural resources, heritage assets. All of these are really threaded together that makes up St. Augustine's unique heritage. And that's what we looked at when we did this study, was the impacts to all of these types of resources that represent St. Augustine's historic way of life over the centuries of its time.
And like you say, preservation, I often say this when we come in and talk about historic preservation, it's not just about renovating buildings.
Right.
It's not just about fixing cracks in walls and dilapidated rooftops.
Yeah, it's what we do to protect our unique sense of place in St. Augustine.
And so this study came about how we do a lot of studies in the city.
We do, and this one is the first comprehensive study that looked at cultural resource and heritage assets that are all across the city in the lens of flood mitigation and sea level rise and what impacts we have from storm events. We've had a lot of momentum leading up to this project. We had a report done in 2016 that gave us a lot of geospatial data. In other words, a way that we could look at a map graphically and envision where flooding is going to impact buildings and cities' infrastructure the most, as well as its cultural resources. But what we wanted to do is dive deeper and look into, well, what could we be doing as the city owns properties that are historic, but also the city is a policymaker. And we have the ability to set an example. So that's what we wanted to do with this project, is to understand how we can set an example for other historic property owners and what we could be doing for policies in the future.
To that, so when you talk about property owners, that obviously are residents, so it's not just what the city can do, but how this study can help our residents. You mentioned those maps. It's the flood range of where you can see this is what our city looks like now. But if you have sea level rise in 50 years, it could look like this. And then all of a sudden you look on that map, and as a resident, you go, my house could be threatened, or maybe my house was impacted by Matthew and Irma or Dorian. So these solutions and these ideas I could potentially use as a homeowner.
Right. And to your first point, one of the things that people can do with this educational tool is to understand what their vulnerabilities are, like you said. So we have a way that we've built into our story map, which is a dynamic resource that you can go to on the city's website and type in your address and find out what your flood zone is. And say you're still trying to learn about what a flood zone is. So in the back of the Resilient Heritage publication, we have a glossary, and that goes over some of the basic principles of flood hazard mitigation nationally. So it's not unique to St. Augustine, but if you're trying to understand what the 1% annual chance floodplain is,
right.
Because if you go to our story map and type in your address and see that you're in that 1% chance, well, what does that really mean?
So before we go too far, the story map web address, if folks are listening, you may not be able to write it down if you're driving in your car, but it's pretty easy.
www.citysainaug.com/resilient heritage story map.
Okay, Resilient Heritage Story Map. And that's where I can go and type in my address.
Correct. So if you go to one of the tabs, if you find a Resilient Heritage Story Map, you're going to see that there are several tabs across the top of the page. And the third one is Protecting the Future of the Past and Flood Mitigation. And on the screen, it's going to show you the different flood zones. You can click on the magnifying glass, and you can type in your address, and it's going to zoom into your property.
Wonderful. And it's going to show me where my house is on the elevation scale. Is it going to give me a projection of what it could look like in 20 years, 50 years, or
not on this particular map?
Okay.
We do have other maps that we're going to be adding into that because, as I was saying earlier, we collected in 2016 all of that geospatial data. So we do have 1.5 to 3 and 5 feet of sea level rise projected across the city.
Okay.
And we can add those to the story map so that you can really see what you stand to lose and what the city stands to lose as we look at our heritage assets.
I'm going to give a plug right here for our GIS team because a lot of that goes through our GIS.
Absolutely.
Our GIS guys that work on that. So we have a lot of interactive maps on the website as well, in addition to these. The results of the study, what if you could distill it down to something, what did we learn from this particular resilient heritage in the nation's oldest city?
Well, first and foremost, it is an educational tool. So the results include a comprehensive wealth of information for anyone who's interested in how to address flood mitigation and historic property conservation. But one of the things that we learned, actually there are several chapters of information that we learned, but one was a way that helps us to understand that we are all, whether we own historic property or just live in the city or just visit the city, we can understand what we stand to lose. We've talked in the past about, let's not ruin the goose that laid the golden egg.
Right.
Well, we were able to actually get a number to put on that golden goose.
Okay.
And it's $2.9 billion.
Wow.
$2.9 billion in heritage assets, which is an economic study that was done by Place Economics. You can go to the Resilient Heritage publication to learn more, but it does explain to us why we should value. If you're not interested in historic preservation, everyone understands the value of the dollar. So we can appreciate what we stand to lose just by looking at our economy because we understand that our economy is driven by heritage tourism.
Absolutely.
So now we have a dollar figure to put to that. So other things that we looked at and learned from in this study is with our archaeology, really emphasizing that the archaeology lab, the Sue Middleton Center, is a resource itself. It is probably the largest collection of Spanish colonial artifacts in the country.
Wow.
And so that is an asset in and of itself. But we also looked at other archaeological policies that we should be considering when trying to increase the ability to preserve and document these valuable resources that are non-renewable in the face of rising seas.
Right. If you're just tuning in, you are listening to The Break Room. I'm Melissa Whistle, Communications Director for the City of St. Augustine. Joining me today in The Break Room, I have Jenny Wolfe, the city's Historic Preservation Officer, talking about flood impacts on the city from the perspective of preserving our historic resources as well as residents preserving their own historic resources living in the historic districts. So what can I do to physically, effectively mitigate what I'm facing in the future?
Sure. If you're a property owner and you want to learn about what are the tools and mechanisms out there for mitigating it against flood damage, our Resilient Heritage Story Map and publication is a great resource. We looked at 3 particular sample properties that are concepts for flood mitigation design when it comes to strategies that could be adopted. So there's some great graphics that are in the story map on one of the tabs, again, that flood mitigation tab. We learned that there are landscape improvements that could be done, something as simple as a berm in a certain area of the property. We know a lot of people in the city have walls, historic property walls around their property. So securing those with temporary flood dams and gates that you can install simply in an impending storm. But other landscape features that we learned about, which is really cool, are the fact that trees can act like straws.
Okay.
So within the publication and on our resources tab of the story map, you can find the link to understand which types of trees to plant in terms of how much water they can absorb.
Okay.
So those are built into some of the concept designs that were proposed with this resilient heritage study. For one, on the Lambias House, it did include floodgates, flood wrap around the building, as well as berms and some of those tree straws. And you could see from the table in the Resilient Heritage publication that, for instance, a 4-inch live oak, which would be a manageable size of tree that you would plant, can intercept 480 gallons of water a year. I mean, that's
a lot of water.
Amazing. So
that's a lot of water.
We need to think about what the natural resources are to flood mitigation as well as the hardening options.
So it's not just let me build a wall around my house or let me duct tape the plastic wrap and such. There's actual livable solutions. And the door dams you're just mentioning too, we've even installed some of those at the wastewater treatment plant. So again, the city is taking those steps based on the research and what we're finding, but there are affordable, eco-friendly solutions that we can use as residents.
Right. And then the other thing that we need to keep in mind are the impacts to our streetscapes. And if we're doing those natural methods, we're also reducing the physical impacts to our historic environment and also doing Mother Nature a good service. There's a table in the back of the publication that I just want to point out because for those, again, who are not as familiar with what flood mitigation is, when we talk about sea level rise or flood hazards, there's a whole list of options that could be applied to historic properties, and they could be applied to non-historic properties as well. But this table is in the appendix of the Resilient Heritage publication, and it provides a whole list and a way to also prioritize some of these depending on what your goals are for mitigating flood at your particular property.
And you just hit on something too. I don't have to be a historic property owner to implement some of these solutions on my own property as a way to protect my own house.
Right. So the first step is inventory your vulnerability and then look at what choices you have and should be considering to improve your flood resistance of your property, historic or not. And this publication and our story map has some really good graphics and sample products for you to look at. They're just concepts at this point, but certainly this was a good starting point to pull together all types of information for potential options to reduce the loss due to flood damage.
And we're all seeing that, and it's not just a hurricane. It could be a nor'easter. It could be flash flooding. It's very real.
It is. We're seeing flooded streets more often, unfortunately. But, yeah.
These solutions, the project documentation is fantastic. The website, again, is www.citysanog.com/resilient heritage for the study itself, and then the /resilient heritage story map for the interactive maps, graphics, GIS mapping. It's really a fascinating tool on the city's website. Jenny, I want to thank you for coming by again. I feel like we just scratched the surface, so we may have you come back again to talk a little bit more. I'm really pleased that in this case, like we were saying, the city does so many of these studies, and we didn't even talk about the funding from this, and we are out of time, but these are solutions that can be helpful to our residents as well. It's not just for the sake of the city itself and our assets, but as a community on the whole, and what our residents can do to protect themselves.
Absolutely. And we try to leverage funds with as little city investment as possible.
We'll talk about that next time. You got to hold that thought. We're going to wrap up another edition of The Break Room. I hope we answered your questions. Be sure to take a minute and check out the website, the web pages that we just mentioned, citysanog.com/resilient heritage and citysanog.com/resilient heritage story map. If we missed anything or you'd like to give us some feedback, send an email to info@citysanog.com. In order to stay connected, you need to be connected, so be sure to like us and follow us on any of our social media platforms. You'll find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at City St. Aug. Just a reminder, Nights of Lights is underway. We want to remind our residents and visitors to mask up. If you're out and about this weekend enjoying the holiday lights, be sure to have your mask handy indoors and outdoors in crowded areas where social distancing is not possible. Until next time, thanks for tuning in.
You've been listening to The Break Room, a weekly program addressing projects and programs offered by the City of St. Augustine. Join us each week as the city's communications director, Melissa Whistle, has in-depth conversations with the people who make our town work to meet the needs of our community. The Break Room is produced by communications specialist for the City of St. Augustine, Cindy Walker, and engineered by Flagler College communication major, Lily McNeil. See you at this time next week for another edition of The Break Room.